Well, thank you. So nice. It's a nice introduction. Good to be in your backyard. I flew north to another, I won't say what state. I was speaking to that state's psychiatric society, and they said they were real excited about the speaker, and this introduction went on, and they said that they had a real famous speaker, but unfortunately, he was too expensive. But Dr. Farah agreed at the last minute to come up and address. So that's really nice. So, this is a talk on Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway. I've just finished a biography of Hemingway, and I got kind of tired of lecturing about Hemingway over and over, so I threw in a bit about Salinger too, because they're very similar. J.D. Salinger and Ernest Hemingway are both individuals whose trauma, particularly war trauma, informed their lives, their work, everything. So this is coming out in April. It's called Hemingway's Brain, and it really is the first forensic psychiatric evaluation of Hemingway and why he killed himself. I think that his suicide is one of the most famous suicides in American history. We have now Robin Williams that people talk about, Marilyn Monroe, and of course Hemingway. And people who've never read a word of Hemingway fiction know that he put a shotgun in the roof of his mouth at about age 61. And this was right after he'd been released from the Mayo Clinic, where he'd received 2 courses of ECT, shock therapy for depression. And I'll tell you where someone came out to the house, real nice lady. They said, "We need a photo of you, for the book." And so we took about 30 or 40 photos, and she said, "These just don't look good." And so we took about 20 more, and she said, they don't look good either. She said, just some people are not photogenic. And, but I find you very attractive. And I thought, well, if it wasn't for that but, I'd be feeling pretty low, But she said, "Let's go out to the barn and take a picture of you and one of the horses, and people can look at the horse, and they don't have to look at you." So that's Bella, the horse on the left, and that's my donkey Clyde. So they're giving me some love. So, but actually, there's not going to be a photo. So this young gentleman too is D.H. Lawrence. I'll get to a quote from him. But the book originated when Bill Smallwood, one of the other, he's the co-author of the Idaho Hemingway. And we met in Greensboro years ago. And he asked, why did Hemingway get worse, not better, after his shock therapy? He'd read that 90% of people get better with their ECT. They don't deteriorate. And I said, well, the patients that we give ECT to that decline rather than improve, these patients generally have some undiagnosed organic brain disease that we didn't know at the time. And the ECT is that physiological stress that pushes them over the edge and causes the dementia to manifest, or the organic brain disease to come out. And that's what the book is about, is what is that organic brain disease. So I'm going to give you a couple of quotes here. The first one is D.H. Lawrence. Let me see if I can find that one. "I cannot define the soul, but nor can the bike define the rider. Our mistake is to pretend there's no one in the saddle." So that was a nice quote to start with. The next one is from Hemingway. "We who had been at the war admired the war crazies, since we knew they had been made so by something that was unbearable, or it was unbearable to them because they were made of a finer, more fragile metal, or because they were simple and understood too clearly." It's an interesting quote. "We admired the war." Can you imagine admiring the war crazy, someone with shell shock or PTSD? "We knew they'd been made so by something that was unbearable. It was unbearable to them because they were made of a finer or more fragile metal, or because they were simple and understood too clearly." That's going to make sense in a little bit too. And J.D. Salinger, "I'm in this world but not of this world." In this world but not of this world. And finally, the last D.H. Lawrence quote, I'll just paraphrase. I think that I have a lot of trouble with this D.H. Lawrence quote, knowing his work. He said that his philosophy came from his novels. It wasn't the other way around, right? His philosophy did not inform his novels and create them. His novels informed his life philosophy and created that. I think that makes more sense with Hemingway and Salinger than it does, but it's a lovely quote. So we'll start with these handsome devils here. On the far left, we have Hemingway in his World War I uniform. He's an ambulance driver at the Italian front. And there's the famous Karsh photo of him with the burly sweater. His wife bought that sweater for him at Christian Dior in Paris. And it was such a popular photo that Karsh would have other people say, well, take a picture of me in a sweater as well. But people this is the mental image we have when someone mentions his name. This kind of substitutes for the mental image. And there's Salinger in his World War II uniform, J.D. Salinger, And there he is as an older gentleman, more of a recluse, as you know. So again, their traumas are where their lives intersect. They met 3 times. There's a apocryphal story that did not happen, but they met 3 times during World War II. Hemingway was there as a correspondent, and Salinger was there as part of the infantry and part of counterintelligence. They met first at the Ritz Hotel in Paris in 1944, and Hemingway was staying there, of course. Salinger met him, and Hemingway said he knew him and he knew his work and liked it. He was referring to the story that had appeared about 6 weeks earlier in the Saturday Evening Post called "The Last Day of the Last Furlough." They met again in the Hurtgen Forest at another time out in France. At the second meeting, Salinger told Hemingway that he was surprised that they finally accepted him into the army because he had only 1 testicle. And Hemingway never doubted his own medical knowledge. He said, well, the doctors were such fools, with a touch of the finger they could have lowered your other testicle. Well, what's interesting about this story is it shows this amazing transference that Salinger had to somebody. He was hero worshiping, right? And he would just be disinhibited enough to say something that personal. He did indeed have an undescended testes, a percentage of people do. But at any rate, it was just fascinating that he was in the hero worship mode of Hemingway. But then he turned, and within 2 decades, Hemingway was a phony to him, and he began to criticize him and dislike him and so forth. Even when the war ended and Salinger checked himself into a Nuremberg psychiatric hospital for battle fatigue, shell shock, PTSD, whatever they categorized it, he was still writing to Hemingway, writing letters to Hemingway, and regretting that there were no Catherine Barclays around the hospital and so forth. But the traumas are different. Hemingway's were organic, Salinger's psychological, but the end result is very similar. There's Hemingway on his boat with his machine gun there, a machine pistol maybe, and there's, of course, the famous Boss shotgun, his favorite. He bought it at Abercrombie & Fitch. So we're going to talk about the reasons for that suicide. And here's Salinger's. This is kind of a famous image of him, too. And there he is as sort of the grumpy old man and the recluse. But people would come. The more seclusive he was, it was sort of, his fans would still come by the dozens, maybe in the hundreds. And they would camp outside of his home in Cornish, New Hampshire, just to get a glimpse of him, leave notes for him. One fellow left a note for his butcher, you know. And he had retreated to what really was kind of a bunker, basically a concrete extension to his own home. Really had little to do with the outside world. Not exactly true, but he didn't want the publicity anymore. It's said that he spent he spent 10 years of his life writing The Catcher in the Rye, and the rest of his life regretting it. It's probably true. So we're going to start with The Lost Generation, because I want to remind folks that Hemingway is not the only one who had a monopoly on mental illness of the Lost Generation. So you have Joyce up here, James Joyce. He had a schizophrenic daughter, and she actually was treated by Carl Jung. He was able to arrange that. Of course, there wasn't a lot of talk therapy or Jungian analysis that was going to help a schizophrenic. And then in the middle top, we have T.S. Eliot, whose first wife, Vivian, was diagnosed with a psychosis, was institutionalized. Once she was put in a psychiatric facility, he never saw her again until her death. Of course, she died there. I take a lot of issue with people calling her schizophrenic because, you know, her biography is very detailed. I think that you might call her borderline traits, but if a young lady was histrionic in the 1920s, they would give her bromide, and bromide will make you hallucinate. And that actually happened to Evelyn Waugh, the novelist, who wrote eloquently about his hallucinations on bromide. But T.S. Eliot later in life married his secretary. Of course, in the bottom middle, we have F. Scott Fitzgerald, alcoholic, died very young of a heart attack, I think 41. And his wife, Zelda Fitzgerald, of course, she has been termed a schizophrenic. I think she was bipolar / schizoaffective, because between periods she was very functional and bright. Hemingway hated her, she hated Hemingway. I think at their first meeting, Hemingway went to their apartment, was visiting with her, and he left before Scott we even came, and they passed in the hall, and he said, "Scott, you realize she's crazy, don't you?" You know? And Hemingway famously said, "You can always trade in one healthy woman for another, but start with a crazy one and see where that gets you." You know? He had very little sympathy for Zelda. She received shock therapy during her life. She received insulin coma. She died here in North Carolina at Highlands Hospital in Asheville. There was a fire. She was given a sleeping pill, put to bed, fire starts in the kitchen, she's on the top floor in a locked area. And by the time, you know, it spread up the dumb waiter, of course, she died probably of smoke inhalation, but she was, some of the patients jumped to safety, but she couldn't. The far right is Ezra Loomis Pound, probably the craziest of the lost generation. He had, I think, an undiagnosed and untreated bipolar condition. He's someone who was always hypomanic, extremely productive, and during World War II decided he was a fascist and he was going to support Mussolini, and he and Mussolini were going to save the world, and Mussolini was going to enact the social credit theories he believed in and save the world economy. He's famous for his anti-Semitism, of course, and his arrest was for broadcasting on shortwave radio what was thought to be anti-American propaganda during World War II. His speech has been transcribed, they're a rambling mess. Bottom line is, what was mania to hypomania to delusion later in life became catatonia and depression. And so the diagnosis became clear. He was hospitalized for 12 years at St. Elizabeth's in Washington. His lawyer thought that if he just had him declared insane, that they'd let him go and he'd go back. He told him, you'll be back in Italy in 6 months. So sure enough, they said, you have a psychosis, though they never really defined it. But that just meant he could not participate in his trial. Treason charges do not drop, they follow you till death. And they were a hangable offense at that time. And the mood of the country was not going to let him go, right? So he sat there in limbo for 12 years. And then his bottom left here is Hilda Doolittle. That was one of his, she was 16 when they met, and that was one of his first quasi-girlfriends. And she followed him to Europe. He drove her away from men altogether, apparently. But she had analysis with Freud himself. So if you look at the lost generation and just think about psychopathology, there seems to be no shortage. Here's our buddy Ernest Miller Hemingway, recently discovered photo of him in his ambulance in Milan. And there he is after his famous injuries at the front. And there he is with the girl he fell in love with and was the inspiration, von Kurowski, the inspiration for Farewell to Arms. So let me see if I have that description of that first injury. He always said that, that Frederick Henry's injuries were the closest to his, and he described what happened. He was near the front. It's within a month of arriving there, and he's outside the trenches delivering things to the troops. A 5-gallon mortar is launched across the river and explodes, and it was filled with rod fragments and scrap metal. It was meant to detonate on impact, so at ground level. So it blows Hemingway several feet, covers him in dirt, kills a couple of people between him and the bomb. So he has his first major concussion at this point, and it's a blast injury, like an IUD. Like a blast injury is different than a head trauma. It's a concussive wave, but it's damaging to the brain, of course. So it throws him several feet. He rouses himself. He's able to pick up a wounded man next to him and run, by his estimation, 150 yards. Now, he didn't remember it later. He was told this. Then he felt what he thought felt like a snowball hitting him in the knee, the icy smack, he described it, and that was machine gun bullets. So that pretty much ended his run. He tumbled forward, unconscious. The man he was carrying was actually already dead. He was so covered in blood that from the wounded man, that at the triage station, which was really just a bombed-out schoolhouse, the Florentine priest going through thought it gave him his last rites right there. But he had his surgery. He recovered in Milan. He was famous for sneaking cognac and bottles into the hospital and getting folks to bring it into him. The head nurse was less than amused. So he would do that later in life. He would also, in hospital, be able to get alcohol. I think some of our patients do that, I think. But bottom line is that was the very first severe trauma. Now, we zoom ahead, and he has this nice scar on his left forehead here. He's in Paris now, late 20s. He has already achieved his fame with Sun Also Rises, In Our Time. He's with his second wife, Pauline. He's left his first wife, Hadley, although there was a time when they were all intimate together. He comes home 11 night. He's drunk. He's out with his buddy Archie McLeish. They've been drinking. He goes into the bathroom of his Paris apartment and goes to flush the commode, which was a chain at the time. But the skylight was partially broken, and the cords had been messed with and mixed up, and in his state of mind and in the darkness and so forth, he's yanking on the wrong cord. He pulls the skylight out of the ceiling and onto his head. So this was another concussive injury. Pauline was able to summon Archie McLeish. They drove him to the American hospital at Newly to get sewn up. But he spoke about he had the ramblings and the giddiness of the concussion in the car, and he had the taste of blood in his mouth that reminded him of his wounds and his previous concussion and the taste of blood before and so forth. And that just unleashed something in him. That trauma led to him sitting down within days and tearing through A Farewell to Arms, writing that out. It was a short story going nowhere, and it became this masterpiece, of course. There's a funny quote. It says, in contemporary photos, he wears the upside-down horseshoe scar as if every day were Ash Wednesday, his outward markings signifying internal change. Biographers and critics find a direct link between the injury and his second major novel, the blood coursing down his face, his giddy ramblings during the ride about his own blood smell and taste, so forth. It was effortless and so forth. My wife says that she'll see that I'm bled just as often as I can write, judging by the way it's been going the last week. The blood set him free, according to one critic. But again, it was another major concussive blow. So here he is in World War II. He was, again, technically a correspondent. This fine man on the far left is Robert Capa, the famous photographer. He died he was a photojournalist for a lot of wars. He died in Indochina, still clutching his camera after stepping on a landmine. But he and Hemingway were buddies, and they were partying in London at his apartment, at Capa's apartment. And so Hemingway climbs in a car after the party with a gentleman who is described as no drunker than Hemingway. Now, it was the Blitz, so London is blacked out. So they're driving along, and they don't see a water tower. They plow right into it, and Hemingway hits the windshield and requires, I think, 57 stitches across his scalp. His beard was covered in blood, and Robert went to the hospital, I think, to see him, and kept calling him Papa, so they all thought he was his son, but they didn't realize that that was his nickname, I guess. So another, we'll get to that one. Also in World War II, he was a bit of a daredevil, of course, Hemingway, that is, and he convinced Capa that there was an interesting attack going on a few miles away, thought we ought to investigate. We put some whiskey, a few machine guns, a bunch of hand grenades in the sidecar and set out in the general direction of the attack, unwisely. So you have Capa, Hemingway, and two drivers. Turning a corner, they unwittingly careened into the path of a German anti-tank gun. According to the news report, a shell soon exploded just 3 yards ahead of Hemingway. Capa's estimate was 10 yards. The explosion threw Hemingway into a ditch. The other four huddled well protected on the other side of the curved road. Capa is said to have continued snapping photos until a second anti-tank shell whizzed too close for comfort. Tracer bullets coming from the light German tank kept kicking up the dirt just in front of Hemingway's helmet, which he gripped tightly, staying as low as he could. His headache was already throbbing, the London concussion rekindled. In Hemingway's account 6 years later, in a letter to Scribner, he recalled, "A tank shell lifted me and dropped me on my head." His head slammed into a boulder in the ditch. So he suffered 2 more concussive blows, the blast injury and the blow when he hit the ground. And here we are in Cuba, another brush with death. After he actually had no trouble diagnosing his own post-concussive symptoms. He reported double vision, memory trouble, speech and thought processing were slower than normal, but verbal skills were lacking, and his headaches used to come in flashes like battery fire. And he just accepted that he would have it. Very common after a concussion to have just this continual headache, a headache that really never goes away but is exacerbated with fatigue and so forth. So here we are in Cuba on the famous boat Pilar, and he's up on the top of that bridge, rocked by a wave, hit on the broadside, and he fell, hit his head on one of the clamps, that holds the rods, I believe. I don't know what you call those. It held the gaffs, maybe. A gash so deep as to expose but not fracture his skull. And he famously joked that the surgeon told him, "Your thick skull saved your life," and he joked that was a form of literary criticism. So again, and there was another motor vehicle accident in Cuba. He was driving his wife to the airport, and he actually, for some reason, told his own driver not to drive, and he was driving the car, and there was some tar in the road from some construction, and it was slippery and mud and so forth, and he hit the windshield there. So again, these concussive injuries just, I'll tell you another interesting, let's see if I can find that quote. He knew what was up. After that boat incident, he said, I'm supposed to be convalescing from a bad spill I had on the flying bridge, wet deck and very heavy sea, and my mate just swung her into the through as I came over the rail. Got 5-inch cut on the back of my head that went to the bone, a concussion, etc. Severed the artery, and it took about 5 or 6 hours before we could get surgical treatment. Luckily, Robert Herrera was there, an old friend, and he was a doctor. It all amounts to this: I can't ski this year again, but I can swim and walk and shoot and fish and work with Jose, though Jose told me not to. But I'm getting tired of getting hit on the head. There were 3 bad ones in 44 and 45, 2 in 43, and the others go back to 18. People think they come from carelessness, but they don't, at least none that I remember did. So again, he had no trouble understanding what was going on. This is the first of his 2 plane crashes in Africa. They're in this single-engine plane. Mary, his 4th wife, is wanting to photograph wildlife and the Murchison Falls and so forth. A flock of ibis is in front of the plane, so the pilot dives. He hits some telegraph wires, and so they crash. A little banged up, not as severe. So they spend the night in the open. There's a herd of elephants that keep getting curious because Hemingway snores very loudly, and they keep walking over to see what's going on. Who are these people in our living room kind of thing. Actually a commercial airliner spots the wreckage and wires back there's no survivors. So they start printing his obituaries in the paper, and he loved that. He loved reading his own obituaries. And I think Joyce said that in Ulysses, read your own obituary, gives you a new lease on life. At any rate, a twin-engine de Havilland picks them up. This is the plane that's been looking for him. Now, this plane lands in Butabi, I think is how you say the place, and they all pile into that plane, and it crashes on takeoff because the runway is just this really badly plowed field, but it's a more violent crash, a fiery crash. So Hemingway has a lot of injuries in that one, and the engine's on fire, and the cockpit's filling up with smoke, so the pilot kicks out the front window. I think that's Roy Cartwright. He pulls Mary out, he gets out. Hemingway's too big to get out the window, so the door's jammed. So he's injured his arm from the previous accident, so he chooses very unwisely to use his head as a battering ram to open the door, giving himself another skull fracture, right, and another concussion. And he just really wasn't the same individual after that second head injury. So what did he have? Well, we've all heard that Hemingway was an alcoholic. Sure, he was a brilliant and highly functional alcoholic. We've all heard that he had bipolar. He didn't have bipolar illness. He never had a manic episode. What he had, by the time that he went to Mayo Clinic, received ECT, was he had chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and he had other components to the dementia, to include possibly a component of alcoholic dementia, possibly a component of vascular dementia, because he had generally untreated hypertension and generally untreated prediabetes, right? His weight really fluctuated. He was given reserpine at one time, which is an old antihypertensive that depletes serotonin and makes you more depressed. The people that get depressed on reserpine are the people who are prone to depression anyway. He was given testosterone at one time, Ritalin at one time, vitamin E, vitamin A. He thought that the E would help his libido, A would help his eyesight. He was taking Seconal at times to sleep. And of course, he was told at one point to cut back. He was allowed 2 glasses of light red wine a day. He once said, of course, a life without alcohol is like driving a race car without motor oil. Great quote. The other great alcohol quote is Churchill, I've taken more out of alcohol than alcohol has taken out of me. At any rate, so by the time he goes in with psychotic depression, right, he looked like a guy with psychotic depression. It's not that they didn't understand dementia pugilistica, right? There were boxers who developed chronic traumatic encephalopathy, but they just didn't diagnose it in Hemingway. But when he got his shock therapy, it was not curative for him because it exacerbated the cognitive deficits, even if it was a temporary exacerbation. It was like a physiological stress on his system that propelled his full manifestation of CTE and mixed dementia. And that's why he killed himself. He thought his mind was lost after the ECT. it's analogous, you'll have, we'll do a consult in the hospital, grandmother's got dementia. Well, she didn't have dementia before she came until she fractured her hip. Yeah, she, 80-something-year-old lady, nice person, never had dementia, has a hip fracture, maybe even has a head injury with that. But now she goes through the medical stress of that. And what was maybe a risk for dementia now is fully manifest. And that's sort of what happened. It's identical to what happened with Hemingway and his ECT. Now, what will we do for him today? Post-concussive, you've heard of post-concussive syndrome. Most concussions, of all the millions of people that have traumatic brain injury each year, most of it's mild, and mild TBI, mild traumatic brain injuries, is synonymous with concussion. You don't have to lose consciousness to have a concussion. The most common symptoms are going to be early on nausea, dizziness, so forth, but headache is very, very, very common. Irritability, mood swings, depression, ringing in the ears, double vision, visual difficulties, light and noise sensitivity, smell sensitivity. And in about 20% of people, even if the head injury is mild, the post-concussion syndrome does not go away, and they require almost indefinite treatment. We have patients I've been seeing for like over 6 or 7 years after a head injury. But each concussion increases the risk of more symptoms the next time. And so for someone like Hemingway, who had multiple concussions and a variety of them, not only trauma, but blast injuries on at least on 2 occasions exactly. Now, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, of course, we have a lot of news about this with our football players. The good news is that NFL players they actually have a lower suicide rate than the base population. But there seem to be a cluster who have CTE who've committed suicide. At any rate, that's when the symptoms are a form of dementia. And in fact, the mechanism is almost identical to dementia, because when there is a concussive injury, you're talking about rapid acceleration, deceleration of the brain. And the brain is floating in a fluid sac and is floating over bony structures. And that's why a lot of times memory is just terrible after these incidents, because the bony structures, the temporal lobes rake over those bony structures, and that causes a lot of damage. But the axons, basically the components of the nerve cells that connect each other, go through shearing, tearing, and they stretching. Then there's a cascade of neurochemical events, inflammatory response, oxidative damage, leakage of cell interior to extracellular space, and so forth, that proceeds to cause damage over weeks to months. So how do we treat this? They say, well, there's nothing you can do, you can just rest. The military uses N-acetylcysteine, NAC, and they megadose it, 4,000 milligrams per week and then 3,000 milligrams. We don't use it that high because it's not really practical. It comes in 300 milligram tablets. It's an awful lot to take. But we do high dose it for the first week, and then we go back down to 600 milligrams a day. But that's an antioxidant, the best antioxidant for the brain, so that helps take care of the free radical damage. Omega-3s, now that is 60% of the brain is omega-3s. You all heard about omega-3s, and the science of omega-3s is all over the map. But there's enough evidence now that it's not going to hurt you, and we've had some success using it in post-concussive patients. Because that's where your membrane integrity comes from. That's the building block of the membrane. And finally, reduced B vitamins. What does that mean? In the Western world, vitamin intake is fantastic. We have folate in the bread. But many patients have difficulty metabolizing their B vitamins to the form that the brain needs that will cross the blood-brain barrier. And if you get the right amounts and the right type of reduced B vitamins across the blood-brain barrier, you lower the homocysteine in the brain, which is a very toxic chemical. And after a concussion, one of the things that may predict whether you get dementia or not is how high is that homocysteine. So we want to lower that homocysteine. You may recognize this triad of things. The NAC is over the counter, and it's $12 a month. The omega-3s, the best one we use is from fastbrain.com. It's $45 for 2 months worth. So it's going to be the cheapest of the ones designed for the brain. And it comes with the phosphatidylserine that the brain needs. And finally, the reduced B vitamins, we use the Inlight. And why is that? Well, that's because that is all the B vitamins, all the micronutrients designed to lower homocysteine across the blood-brain barrier. Now, that is the same when people come to see us after the kids with soccer injuries and football injuries and car accidents with concussion, they get this, but so do the new onset schizophrenics. And you may see this when they leave the hospital. So we'll admit 1 or 2 kids, I'm calling them kids, 18-year-old kids, a month, and maybe every 2 months, we'll admit 1 or 2 of these heavily dependent cannabis patients who has new onset schizophrenia. because we know that it's been something like 8 to 15% of schizophrenia is because marijuana. These kids are using marijuana. They have a genetic risk that the cannabis interacts with their genetic markers and the basic certain genes, AKT1 gene, CMT gene, and so forth. And now they cannot metabolize dopamine. So what is a short-term drug-induced psychosis becomes a permanent schizophrenia. And the best thing to do is similar neuroprotection. They have to be drug-free. They do get an antipsychotic, but you've seen them come out of the hospital with the same cocktail that I'm giving folks who've had head injuries. But that's what we do for Ernest Miller Hemingway. We probably wouldn't give him ECT if he presented today. Would he get an antidepressant? Sure. We probably would, but the B vitamins can work sometimes just as well. Would he get an antipsychotic? Well, I had a hard time giving a genius an antipsychotic. I don't want to compromise, don't want any cognitive slowing, but he did have a lot of paranoia towards the end there. But again, the primary diagnosis was one of a dementia from CTE and those other factors such as alcoholism and possibly vascular. The depression sprang from that. Let's treat the underlying cause and see what happens, is what I do with him. So now we move to our buddy Jerome David Salinger. Grows up in New York, certainly younger than Hemingway, of course. He was a D-Day guy. And let's see, I think he was 12th Infantry. I'll get his rank right. But he was a sergeant, and he was counterintelligence. He was generally a scout in counterintelligence. So he knew French, he knew German, he would interrogate prisoners. And let's see. And yes, if somebody, I mean, he and his buddies, if somebody needed to be shot, they would shoot him. You know, if they wanted to find out where the German troops were, they would find out. And so what not many people know, 12th Infantry, landed on D-Day, Utah Beach, fought at the Battle of the Bulge and the Hurtgen Forest. The whole time he's walking around with the first 6 chapters of Catcher in the Rye in his pocket. Can you imagine? Isn't that amazing? So after the war, he's, I guess to be complete, enough battles, right? Then he marches into one of the subcamps of Dachau. At that point, he talks about the smell of burning flesh and so forth. At that point, he does have PTSD. At that point, he's had enough. So he checks himself into a hospital, a civilian, not a military hospital in Nuremberg. But while he's in Germany, he does a 6-month stint there for the denazification. He meets this lovely, beautiful young lady, Sylvia Welter, I think. They get married. But she has a bit of a suspicious background. He learns not long after their marriage that she was a Gestapo informant. So you have this half-Jewish guy working in counterintelligence, marrying a Nazi, right? Gestapo agent, Gestapo informant. So that, of course, was another psychological trauma for him. And the other psychological traumas would follow. I'll get to this in a sec, I guess. You know, he publishes Catcher in the Rye, and he publishes the 9 stories. But I think 64, I think was the last time he published anything. He became this reclusive fellow who everything he had been writing since the late 60s is in a vault. It's supposed to be published. I haven't seen it yet. But he retreated to this interior world. You know, Hemingway's way of dealing with his trauma was to go out and fight it. I mean, he was killing everything, and he took on the world. Whereas Salinger regressed to the point of even becoming infatuated with 14-year-old girls and such. And he did not have intimate contact with these girls, but he said, I served in the 12th Infantry during the war. I always write about very young people. So he became so regressed in his own mind, and he also became so involved in Vedanta Hinduism, rejection of the, you know, it's this idea of rejection of the body, rejection of money, you know, and he became sort of an ascetic. But I think the last 3 hammer blows to his psyche were, of course, you know, the murder of John Lennon, and not only Mark David Chapman, but Robert Bardo, I think, and John Hinckley. These are all people that use Catcher in the Rye as a springboard for their murders, right? Their justification, their psychosis was somehow fueled by this work. Now, it's an amazing work. It so beautifully articulates anybody's adolescent angst that it just kind of universally works for anybody with adolescent angst. And so many people identify it generation after generation. But to have it sort of co-opted for such evil, I think he never really commented on what that meant to him. But I'd probably hide too. Somebody took something I created and went out and did those horrible things. I think those were the last hammer blows to his ego. So that's really the treatment for him what would you do? For severe PTSD, I think his Vedanta Hinduism was his sort of therapy. His writing was his retreat. But I don't know, medication-wise, interesting, I mentioned the reduction of homocysteine. The course of PTSD is predicted by how high homocysteine is. So think of the first quote, the war crazies were made so because they were made of something finer metal. They understood too well. That's Salinger, right? Think of I'm in this world but not of this world. The quotes are reversed. That's Hemingway at the end with the form of dementia.